of reasons, Capcom and other Japanese publishers are trying to appeal to a more global audience. Part of it is ballooning budgets. Japan simply isn't a big enough market to recoup a $30 million game. Part of it is an increased interest in mobile platforms by Japanese audiences. Part of it is the failure of traditionally Japanese genres to carry the weight they once did overseas. And part of it is simply the need to expand globally to appease stockholders. You can see this in games like Bionic Commando. Developed by now-defunct developer Grin in Stockholm, Sweden, the game featured a gruff soldier voiced by Steve Blum. Or in Dark Void, developed by Redmond-based Airtight Games, where you play a Rocketeer-inspired adventurer during World War II, thwarting trans-dimensional beings who are helping the Axis. You can also see this in games like Dead Rising, the first of which was a game by Japanese developers about an American journalist in an American city covering a conspiracy by the American government, and the second of which was a Canadian game about an American motorcycle driver in an American city uncovering an American pharmaceutical company's wrongdoings. My point is that all of these Capcom games center around a white, ostensibly American male character shooting people. In their attempts to appease a global market, Capcom were trying to expand their audience by emulating Western and primarily American tastes. They saw the success of this stuff, and Capcom wanted to follow suit. And this is where Resident Evil 5 sort of starts tripping up. The franchise has its roots in survival horror, and to that end...
Hey, wait a second!
HyperBitHero?
Yeah, I heard you were doing an episode on Resident Evil 5.
Yeah, I'm doing it now.
Well, I just thought I might be able to lend some insight on the genre, seeing as it is my favorite. You know, go over some history on the series and stuff like that.
Sure, okay, this'll be fun.
Thanks, man. Alright, so where to begin? Resident Evil first premiered on the PlayStation 1 in 1996. It was originally meant to be a remake of Sweet Home, an earlier horror game by Capcom for the NES, and it was actually the first to coin the term survival horror. The game was hugely influential and stands as one of, if not the, most important game in the genre. The setup was that there were a bunch of members of a special forces unit stuck in a mansion full of zombies, and throughout the game you unravel a conspiracy revolving around the Umbrella Corporation and their work with mutagenic viruses. While nowadays the game is known more for its cheesy live-action sequences and hilarious voice acting, at the time of its release, this was groundbreaking stuff. A game had never been able to create this much tension and suspense before.
But there's not really that tension anymore. I remember going from room to room without a single infected in the first Resident Evil games, and it was that fear that the next room was going to be the one where I was finally jumped that made the game so gripping. Now every single room is loaded with infected. Infected men, infected ladies, that dog from John Carpenter's The Thing, infected pus volcano head guys. There's no suspense. In earlier Resident Evil games, a single infected was a serious threat. Now you're shooting down dozens of these things, punching them in the face and performing wrestling moves on them. The military setting, the constant shooting, the removal of all of Resident Evil's adventure game trappings, it's almost like this is a crappy action game.
That's because it is!
Wait, what?
The game doesn't just fail to properly convey its horror elements, it completely abandons them. Earlier games in the series went out of their way to emphasize a sense of dread. From their visual design and pacing to their level structure and core mechanics. All of it was in service to the player's fear of what could be in the next room. With this game, much of that is lost. The majority of the game takes place in well-lit areas designed for combat. Gone are the claustrophobic corridors and blind corners of earlier Resident Evil games. And gone too are the dark hallways drenched in shadow. But that's not to say you can't make a horror game in this setting. Just look at one of the first trailers for the game. It depicts a quiet, eerie village with no one in sight. This could have been done really well, but instead they decided to make this.
I just had an extreme makeover!
But maybe they were going for a more modern Eli Roth take on horror? You know, less about atmosphere and suspense and more about the physicality of gore and uncomfortableness with their own biology. It could explain why they have all this emphasis on direct lighting and physical violence and bodily fluids.
Do you really believe any of those words you just said?
No.
Besides, it's more than just the setting and lighting conditions that make this an action game. The game's mechanics themselves have been revamped. Remember when you had to use ink ribbons to save? And how you had to make some serious choices about whether the progress you've made so far was worth one of them? It made progress tenuous and put pressure on the player to conserve using saves as safe fallback points, heightening the penalty for death and, as a result, making the prospect of death even more terrifying. What was it that Resident Evil 5 did with saves again?
It autosaves at checkpoints like Gears or Halo.
And then there's the fact that the entire game is a co-op experience from top to bottom. It's not that you can't make a scary game with a social element, But there's something to be said about the mind games that isolation can provoke. Imagine if Amnesia had a co-op mode where you could share oil, or if Silent Hill let two players voice chat.
What confounds me about the decision to focus on co-op is that only one or two mechanics ever really make use of it. That part in the dark where one person had to hold the light is sorta cool, as is the ability to help a friend recover when their health is low. That comes in handy. But aside from a few things like that, it's basically just two characters gunning down infected people. It's like they wanted a multiplayer shooter audience so bad that they based an entire game around the concept of what if two people could play Resident Evil at once?
At this point, the game seems more interested in telling its increasingly implausible soap opera. Wesker's back and he's kidnapped Jill and made her into some sort of mind slave, and he wants to release Ouroboros, which turns out to be a virus parasite thing that transforms people into superhuman megabosses made of tentacles.
Speaking of the story, the series seems to be taking its cues from Metal Gear. And not just the fact that they're emphasizing combat. There's this whole, what is the point of fighting theme that bookends the game, as well as a discussion about bioterrorism and the difficulty stopping the proliferation of bioweapons. But it never comes close to Kojima's works. Kojima not only had an entire fiction dedicated to the various sorts of armed and clandestine military operations that were in his games, but also mechanics that reinforced those narratives. Arms dealers, trading in jailbroken weapons, planned obsolescence for both weapons and soldiers, and a shift in game mechanics from outright espionage to more stealthy urban gunplay all hammer home concepts that Kojima wanted to discuss. Resident Evil has Matrix fights with Wesker and a wishy-washy, yeah, maybe life is worth fighting for, conclusion. And bioweapons that turn you into wormhead people.
The end result is that even the story sucks away much of the tension. Like I said, the series has always been known for a certain amount of corniness.
Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
But it was B-grade horror, not B-grade action. Bad zombie movie bad, not bad Steven Seagal movie bad.
Okay, so the game isn't really scary anymore, and doesn't have much to do with the original games in the series. Franchises change direction regularly, right? I mean, it happened to Red Faction over and over and over, and most of those games were okay. And both the upcoming BioShock and Max Payne games take their franchises in surprising new directions that might be a breath of fresh air. I guess what I'm saying is that there's no intrinsic reason an action-packed shooter in the Resident Evil universe should be bad, But
the game plays terribly. There are all of these mechanics kept in from Resident Evil 4 that just don't fit in an action title. And I know some people consider Resident Evil 4 to be an action title itself, but we can all agree that it's not to this extent. Ammo scarcity persists, and the whole point of providing players with small quantities of ammunition in survival horror is to force them to decide whether to shoot or flee. But in this game, you're actually forced to kill everything to move to the next room. So instead of a compelling resource management mechanic, we have a system that bleeds players dry and forces them to melee constantly. Having to stop to shoot is a holdover from the days when you had to make a very serious, tense flight or fight decision. Do you stop in a room full of zombies to shoot them, leaving yourself vulnerable, or do you just try to run straight through? That decision is gone now since you have to keep killing zombies. And now it's just a frustration that causes damage you can't avoid during big gunfights. And yeah, later on in the game, the infected actually get guns, making these movement issues even more frustrating. Fighting isn't fluid at all and actually becomes really tedious. You'll run away, turn around, pop off a few shots, then run further away. Over and over again. It's not horrifying and scary, and it's not thrilling and adrenaline pumping, it's just monotonous. The game doesn't achieve the fear that its predecessors had, or the excitement of the action games it's emulating, and the overall effect is that the game just feels like work.
Actually, there is one context where the game managed to make people's emotions run high.
Wait, you're not gonna bring up—
Oh yes, I am. Now, for those who don't know, the game caused a bit of a kerfluffle in the months before its release when Nagai Kroll and others questioned some of the imagery in the game's trailers. Specifically, there was a lot of dialogue about whether it was quote-unquote racist, and this being an internet debate, things quickly jumped the rails into full-on idiocy shortly thereafter. First of all, let's be clear. What Nagai Kroll was commenting on in the trailer wasn't, "Oh my god, they're shooting black infected people!" He was lamenting the presentation of these people, uninfected, regular civilians, as shadowed, threatening, and in his words, othered. Seriously, watch the trailer again. There's a lot of racial subtext in the way the imagery is presented, with the lone, well-lit, clean-cut white guy coming into the town full of glassy-eyed black people veiled in shadow, especially in the context of an American audience.
But to be fair, the final game is actually way less intense on this imagery. Hordes are racially mixed, although for some reason women are really rare, and the African setting is largely downplayed. The scene in the trailer is even helped a bit by having Sheva along when it plays out in-game, reframing the issue as a conspiracy against outsiders rather than an implied racial tension.
Then you reach the second chapter. You know how the Mudmen in Left 4 Dead 2 could be seen as maybe just a smidge offensive to people living in the South? They're not really built to be offensive, they're just sort of an amalgamation of a number of stereotypes. The bayou-dwelling, backwoods swamp people, simple hillbilly folk with banjos and pidgin English. The game certainly isn't saying all Southerners are like this, but their inclusion sort of taps some undercurrent of the deep-rooted stereotypes certain Southerners are still struggling to escape from in the minds of a lot of people. Yeah, this is sort of that from an African tribal perspective. I mean, there are tribes in Africa, but they're entire cultures with their own religions, traditions, and values. Here the concept of African tribes is basically boiled down to grass skirts and tribal headgear in order to provide a slight twist on established military bad guy models. Worse, the game presents these stereotypical images as mindless killing machines, then has a white guy come in and kill them all in the name of good and cleansing the land. Yeah, that's starting to get back into questionable territory again. Then there's, well, this. If the tribes were simply an exercise in reinforcing stereotypes, this has got to be an exercise in outright exploiting them.
Still, I hesitate to call the game racist per se. It definitely invokes imagery that, in the United States in 2012, could be considered insensitive. There are just so many viewpoints that you need to consider, and it eventually isn't really worth the headache. It's a fictionalized version of Africa created by Japanese developers as seen through the lens of American history and American iconography. It's just really complicated to look at objectively.
But I think the game's stilted presentation of race is a bit of a microcosm of the problems with the rest of the game. Resident Evil 5 means well, but it's ultimately confused by the very topics it brings up. It's a shooter game weighed down by survival horror tropes. It's a B-movie action game that accidentally ends up evoking the uncomfortable topic of the white man's burden. Its Call of Duty is played by Isaac from Dead Space. But mostly it's a single-player Japanese horror game doing a bad impersonation of a Western multiplayer action game.
The good news is that future games in the series seem to have learned from this awkward hybrid. The series is sort of split into two directions, with titles either being full-on action or survival horror. On one hand, you have Operation Raccoon City, a team-based shooter focused on just killing stuff. And on the other hand, you have Revelations for the 3DS, which has gone back to the claustrophobic hallways and scarce enemies from the earlier titles.
And it's good to know that Capcom is capable of learning from its mistakes, whether the future of Resident Evil is creeping horrors and dark hallways or multiplayer extravaganzas full of explosions.
It's me, Chris! Don't you recognize me?